Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be discussing the outcomes of a recent CRC project that we've been working on, looking at the values, priorities and decision making for regional waterway management. And I hope those of you in Australia have got your lunch in front of you, and I noticed someone else has just joined from Egypt at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m, so I hope you've got a cup of coffee with you. I am Avril Vaughan, and I've been the project lead for this work, and I'm from the Department of Engineering at the University of Melbourne, where I run the Managing Climate Change and Variability Lab group. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters upon and around which we are situated. So for me, I'm currently in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. However, much of this project was undertaken in northern Victoria on the traditional lands of Yorta Yorta and Taungurung nations. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge their deep cultural, social, spiritual, environmental and economic connection to their lands and waters. So I'd like you to invite you to write in the chat and acknowledge the traditional owners on the location that you are joining from today. And I can already see a range of different places popping up, and it's interesting to see the range of different places that we're located. The research that we're presenting today is part of the One Basin CRC. The One Basin CRC is an industry and research collaboration aiming to solve significant and complex water-related challenges in the Murray-Darling Basin. It's a partnership across 85 industry organisations from around Australia, aiming to achieve a more productive, resilient and sustainable Murray-Darling Basin and beyond. The work we're presenting today is one of the early projects in the CRC's research program, and it's one of a large number of very diverse projects that are currently happening around the basin. So I encourage you to jump onto the One Basin CRC website and get a sense of the broader range of projects that are happening, and to listen out for future webinars. So moving into the presentation we've got today. This research was very much evolved out of a conversation with the Golden Broken CMA and the North East CMA here in Victoria. A key challenge that they've identified through their work on our water futures is understanding the multiple and overlapping processes and institutions that shape decision making around water in their region. And they're wanting to, one of the key challenges is about how you identify the communities of interest, the planning processes and the way that you incorporate the community values and perspectives within that planning process. And so this project really aimed to answer 3 questions to support that challenge. And those questions are up on the screen. And I just sort of, with those institutions on the bottom, I wanted to flag that there are a range of different institutions and people that have been involved, and that this project wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration with the 2 CMAs. But also, we're very grateful to a number of community members that volunteered their time through the project. It's very difficult to do a project on community values and priorities without having community that are willing to engage in the research and participate. So we're very grateful for the time and energy that they've put in as well. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panel members for today. We've got 3 panellists, all who have played a really big role in the project: Madeline Gruper, Melissa Kennedy and Simon Cohen. And I'll get each of them to introduce themselves. Maddie and Melissa are going to give a presentation, and then Simon will join them for a panel discussion for the Q&A. So I'll hand over to you first, Melissa, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Avril. Hi, everyone. My name's Melissa Kennedy. I'm a Tati First Nations person, so I belong to Murray River Country, between the Murrumbidgee Junction all the way up to the Barker Junction, and I also have ties inland to the Muddy Muddy and also Waddy Waddy peoples. I'm a research fellow in water policy and social science at the University of Melbourne, working with Avril and Maddie, and I'm also a senior Atlantic fellow for social equity, which is a global fellowship program. But my work is primarily focused on the connections between people and waterways and the relationships that we have, and how that affects our well-being and the impacts on policy and decision-making, both globally and in the Murray-Darling Basin. So I'm excited to be having a chat today, and I look forward to some of your questions.
Maddie.
All right. Hi, I'm Maddie Grouper, Madeline. I also work with Avril and Mel. I'm originally from the United States, but I've been in Australia for the past 3 years, working as a PhD student in the Department of Environmental Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of Melbourne, with Avril. And my research focuses on sort of the intersection between ecology and social science and how that can be applied to support water management. So I'm excited to talk to you more.
And Simon.
Thanks, Avril, and hi, everyone. My name's Simon Cowan. I'm with the Golden Broken Catchment Management Authority here in Northern Victoria, based in Shepparton. So I'm a program manager of river and wetland health, and I guess I've worked in a range of water management, water resource management and planning roles over the last 25 plus years, particularly in this part of the world, and probably had the opportunity to input to a range of different sort of community engagement around processes around policy and policy development, seen some significant changes over a couple of decades. So I'm really passionate about water resource sustainability and catchment health, and building community capacity and understanding and connection to the water we rely on, and collaborating with others to sort of find practical ways to tackle the challenges around water resource management and climate change in particular. So looking forward to today and the questions that might come our way. So thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So I'll move on to handing over to Melissa to start the first presentation. Maddie will present some of her work, and we'll then head to the Q&A session. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, Avril. Let me just get this started. Okay, so as Avril mentioned, we really had those 3 key questions that we were working on with our research with the CMAs. But we were essentially looking around values, priorities, and decision-making. So I'm going to speak to 2 of those questions, and then Maddie will come after and speak to the 3rd one. So the work that I've been doing has been around what is the role of the CMAs in water management and climate adaptation. And we went about that by interviewing waterway managers, both from the CMAs, but also within the basin as a whole. And then the second part of my study is around how values are being represented in current strategy documents. So this was a literature review of the existing strategies from the region. So I'll speak to each of those 2 studies separately. So Avril gave us a bit of an overview of the region that we're speaking about, but you can see here from this map, we're looking at the Golden Broken and the northeast region of Victoria, which are the traditional lands of Yorta Yorta, Tanarong, Bangarang, Nuray Ilamurung, Doodaroa, Weweru and Yatmatang. And so really working closely with the CMAs to find out what is going to help them and enable them to better adapt to climate change. So this first study, we did a qualitative analysis of waterway manager interviews. So we went out and we did 22 semi-structured interviews with water managers operating sort of at the local, state and federal levels. And we targeted individuals with that direct experience with water resource management. So our interviews were semi-structured to allow for some in-depth responses. So we had a set of questions, but then we had additional prompt questions that we could follow on from those. Following those 22 interviews, they were transcribed and coded, and we really took a social science approach to this in coding and as well as our qualitative data analysis to try and find the key themes of these interviews that were happening. So again, we used that inductive and deductive analysis based from social science. The organisations that were part of those interviews include the Golden Broken CMA, Northeast CMA, the Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, so DECA, the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, the VIEW, and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And so that they made up sort of all of the people that were interviewed. And so the key questions or the key things that we were trying to understand were how these roles and responsibilities of the CMAs are understood across those different levels of governance, and what are the challenges to the CMAs fulfilling this role. And then additionally, how decision-making is happening within the CMAs and what are some of those decision-making structures. And then following on from that, where values are embedded in those decision-making processes. So who is responsible for making decisions and how are our values informing those decisions? And this is just a little word cloud of the raw data from those transcriptions. And the larger the word is, the more common it was in those transcriptions. So the key findings from this analysis, and there's quite a few, but I won't go into too many of them. I'll just sort of highlight the most important ones that we found, the challenges. So there really seemed to be this differing view on the role and responsibility of the CMAs, particularly around their operational versus strategic priorities. And so you can see from that graph there's a real difference in whether the response is from the CMA staff or from participants who worked outside of the CMAs. So non-CMAs were more likely to report policy and decision-making as a key component of a CMA staff member's role or responsibility, whereas the CMA staff really identified more with that operational on-ground delivery of their roles. But as you can see, climate change featured really highly for the CMA staff, whereas it was hardly mentioned with the non-CMA staff. So we can kind of see from these results that there is something going on, and there's some difference that's happening between our understanding of what the CMA's roles are. I think this highlights too how multi-level governance is creating inconsistencies in these understandings. Further sort of key findings were around the challenges, and we didn't find too much of a difference between whether it was internal CMA staff versus external staff. Overall, kind of there was the similar report or response to some of these challenges, but you can see that they're featuring really highly there is the resources and funding. It's the most prominent issue that people spoke about, particularly around the fact that there's no long-term delivery priorities for that funding. And so staff are feeling like they're funded on much smaller projects or project at a time, and they're unable to really look at climate mitigation or adaptation into the future because they might only have a 12 or a 24-month funding cycle, for example. Climate change and capacity constraints, those two kind of went hand in hand, even though they're spread out separately here. But this was more around the demand of staff and the capacity that they have to start addressing some of these climate change issues. Again, quite closely linked with resources and funding, but it really is around the capacity and the time constraints that staff are having to be fulfilling the jobs and the role of this particular funding source that they have in that program, while also sort of tacking on these climate change priorities to the end of each of those projects. So some other challenges that came up there, like we've got some really rich data on this, and there will be some reports and a journal paper published from this later. So if you are interested in finding these specific results, this will be available in the future, but I won't go through them in detail. So the second part of the study was this literature review. And so this was where we did an analysis of 19 key documents relevant to these regions. And again, they were selected based on their relevance to water management. Our study wanted to explore the representation of values in these policy and strategy documents across levels of governance. So it wasn't just looking at the CMA's reports either. If there were other documents that related to this region, we looked at those as well. And so we used a qualitative content analysis approach to understand how the agencies at these differing governance scales are articulating and contextualising values about water within the context of climate change. Now, we use these subcategories for coding our themes, and this was a deliberate choice to use the themes that were already in use in these documents. So that's the economic, environmental, social, and First Nations. that decision was made on purpose to see how often they were coming up in these specific categories. And so we have some key findings here. Overall, all documents do refer in some way to the economic, social, environmental and cultural values. However, there are some pretty significant differences at those different governance levels. So you can see these radar plots for each of those three themes: economic, environmental and social. You can see the differences between the catchment, the state and the federal level on just a slight change of perhaps wording or focus, and it really highlights how language is important and how different levels of government are valuing these different bins. As you can see, though, there isn't a radar plot for First Nations values. It was more difficult to be able to create something like this out of First Nations values because of the vague way that they were being reported. In some documents, First Nations groups were able to directly have input and articulate in their own words their values. And this is seen as quite a positive way of self-representation for those nations. And many nations reported that as being empowering and essential, as it provides them space to be speaking to their own values. Whereas most other documents tended to generalise First Nations values under this umbrella term of cultural values. And while this is a seemingly inclusive approach, it does still segregate those Indigenous values into its own bin, implying that social, economic and environmental values are, again, separate from cultural values. And so this also implies that non-Indigenous people lack cultural values. And so this separation of values is actually quite problematic. So if I could just pull out some really key points, again, out of a lot, but the main things that we found was that there was just no definition of values. So where there is no deliberate approach to defining values, there is this tendency to float between definitions without clearly explaining what you're talking about. And so this means it's difficult to decipher what values were used to inform what management decisions. Secondly, there were no values typologies or frameworks used, and I'll touch on this in the next slides, but the documents were more likely to focus on themes, objectives, outcomes, priority actions, which, I'm sure you're all familiar with and seem to make sense, but without defining kind of the values framework that you're using to determine these objectives, outcomes and priorities. There's really a blurred distinction occurring between what's a value versus what's a critical attribute, what's a benefit, what's a service. There was also no mention of the role of values in decision-making, or very, very little mention of values in decision-making. And again, this just continues to make it unclear how values are informing our decisions. And so when that's a key thing that we want to be finding out, it's quite difficult to find that in the current documents or strategies in place. Going back to these themes, those bins that we spoke about before, that values are categorised into those 4 themes of environmental, social, economic and cultural. This creates a zero-sum game. The consequences of a zero-sum scenario in environmental policy is it's implied there's winners and losers, and that things have to be traded off against each other. So this again contributes to challenges when, particularly when you've got economic growth as a priority, environmental protection as a priority. There really seems to be a trade-off going on when you do categorise into these zero-sum bins. And so finally, again, to summarise that cultural values are often vague and separated from those other 3 categories: environmental, social, economic. This is isolating, an isolation of Indigenous values, but also it isolates the relationship that different values have with each other and other categories. So it removes that relational element of the intermingling of different types of values. So we have a few recommendations that have come out of this research, but what I want to just touch on very briefly is The idea around embedding a values framework into the work that CMAs and environmental managers are doing, and also considering inclusion of relational values within the work that you're doing. Clearly, there is a need that we saw earlier when I was talking about the interviews to understand and be better aligned with what the CMA's role is, and also that decision-making approach. We need a hybrid decision-making approach. But for the purpose of the time that I have today, I just want to touch quickly on our values frameworks and how that could be useful to environmental managers. So what is a values framework? What do we mean when we say a values framework? A values framework in social science, I guess, can be understood as a structure, an underlying structure of the concept of human values. This is something that has been researched throughout history because of the importance of values in human life, in society. And so there are, hundreds of different types of values frameworks out there, depending on what, industry or what the research is about. But I wanted to show you this example. And so this is a way that a values framework can be thought about in the context of environmental science. So this is a figure from a 2023 paper by Raymond et al. And it talks about an inclusive typology that organizes nature's values into these concentric layers. So you can see the 4 layers starting at the bottom with worldviews, moving up to broad values, specific values, and then values indicators. So what we found in the literature review is that a lot of the values that was used in those documents kind of sat at those top 2 levels of values indicators or a specific value, but it was quite confusing what kind of perspective or where those values had come from without starting at the bottom and moving your way up. The other thing to think about when looking at this figure is the spotlights on the right-hand side. And so what these spotlights are really talking about is how when you've got different groups of people or different ways of being in nature, you're going to have slightly different values. So while those concentric layers have meaning to a certain group of people, say you might have agricultural interests or you might have environmental sustainability interests, those different concentric layers are actually going to change and shift a little bit depending on what spotlight you're using to look at those. So if anyone's interested in this, we can share this as well with you at the end. It's a really great paper and a good way of thinking about values in environmental science. But I mentioned before relational values and how environmental managers could start to think about relational values in the context of environmental science. So relational values have attracted a great deal of attention in recent years, particularly in environmental science. And it really talks about the principles of the human nature relationship, the relationships between people and place, and how to bring that back into how we're looking at science. And it includes concepts and a range of kind of social science definitions, humanities, but I think making a place for this kind of thinking within environmental science is going to be really, really important moving forward under climate change. But I guess the question is, and where this can get a bit vague, is, what is a relational value? What isn't a relational value? How do they compare with other values categories? What's the difference between a relational value versus an environmental value? So I think that's the work that we need to be doing in environmental science to really start to understand what that means. This particular figure here, the authors of this paper talk about relational values as a critical avenue for the inclusion of diverse social science perspectives in sustainability science. So there is a lot of resources out there if you're interested in this, where you can start reading about how other scientists and academics are trying to embed these kinds of things into their environmental strategies. I think the key thing to take away from this, though, is that relational values are not values of a thing. It's the value or the component of relationships with nature, between people and nature. And just again, for another perspective or another way of looking at values in the work that we do, Dr. Mary Graham, who's a Kumba woman from University of Queensland, she's an associate professor in political science. She discusses how Aboriginal relationality is complex, and it's a refined system of all of these different obligations and values in an ordered way. And so this is how she has developed her kind of relationality or her values framework, which is very different to sort of some of the other ones. And I think you're going to see some values frameworks might be appropriate for certain things, whereas some, might be vastly different for others. But this work, particularly by Dr. Mary Graham, speaks about relationality as the multiple ways that we connect with land and with each other. And so she details those kind of 4 characteristics of Aboriginal relationality as key to that: the ethics, place, autonomy, and balance. And from there, you can derive your values and the things that are underpinned by those values. So happy to share these papers at the end, and if anyone has any further questions, I can talk a little bit more in the chat. But at this stage, I will pass it over to Maddie to talk to the next stage of our research.
I might just, while Maddie's loading up her slides, Mel, there's a couple of questions that have come through. So I might just ask, one of the questions was around that values are implied in a lot of existing public sector decision making, and so why or how we describe values in policy, why that is worth making explicit.
Yeah, I think the importance of language in policy and when we talk about values is really, really important. There's a lot of literature and science behind how we use language and how that can impact, I guess, the community connection to the work that we're doing. And I think this might touch a little bit on what Maddie speaks about next too as well. But when you've got community that can't connect to the policy or the strategy or the work that we're doing in environmental science, how do we start to change that? How do we think about bringing that relational element back into it so that people feel as though they can see themselves in the policy, they can see themselves in the priorities? And so while things might be implied, I think it's really important that we start to become more obvious with our values and start to detail those so that people can start to understand the decisions that are being made.
You're on mute, Avril.
Thank you. Do you think that decision makers at the moment are unconscious about the way in which their own values influence their actions and decision making, and what that might mean for the way that other people's values are represented in the decisions that get made?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's work to be done around decision making in government and in policy work. One of the things that was also really clear when we did the interviews, when questions were asked around decision making, people didn't really know how to respond to that. The questions were, how are decisions made? What kind of water management decisions have you made recently? How are values impacting your decisions? And most people didn't know how to answer that. And so I think starting to be more conscious of what decision making means and how we are making decisions and what values are influencing our decisions is really important, because at the moment, from the work that we've done, at least from these interviews, it's not something that is spoken about or thought about. I think decisions are just being made, and perhaps values aren't really part of that conversation.
Thanks, Mel. I'd encourage people to use the Q&A function on Zoom and keep adding questions in. I'll get Maddie to make a start on her presentation, and there'll be more time for questions from Melissa at the end.
My name's Maddie, and I'm going to be building a lot on the work that Mel already showed you guys, talking a lot about how we could apply that to community members. And so we took a lot of the work that was done with that background in literature, with that background talking to managers. And the next question is, well, how do community members take and interpret values? And so a lot of effort has gone into including community interests into water policy. But a big problem is that those community members don't always feel represented. So we wanted to start this study with a big question, which is, what information do managers need from community members to represent them better in policy? Well, what information is in policy? Mel just spoke about that. That's values. And it's not a problem if some community members have different values. You know, some people might value the river and its water for their connection to the rest of their communities. Some might value it for their cultural connection to the land, or for their ability to make a living and produce agriculture, or to recreate, or because they love nature. There are a lot of ways that you can value nature and rivers and water. And I just named some very specific ones, sort of similar to what's in policy. There are a lot more abstract ways, but it's not a problem if some community members value it for one particular reason and another community member values it for a different one, unless there's not enough water to go around. And then those values might start to compete, and people could start to feel a need to set priorities. So in a future with water availability, that's more likely to happen. And it's more likely that there's going to be less water, and it's more likely that we're going to need to figure out how to represent those values despite it. So the question is, are values and the way that we elicit them and represent them giving us the information that we need to plan for the future? Or do we need to look at priorities? And like Mel said, there's been a significant effort to express community values in policy documents, but not necessarily community priorities. These two concepts are related, but we don't actually know if they're the same. So is what someone values the same as what they would prioritize with less water? Because if so, then the documents that we looked at are kind of looking at the information we already need, although there's a huge question around frameworks and there's a huge question around which values. But if not, then that gets a little bit trickier. So to answer these questions, I went out and interviewed folks around the Goulburn Broken catchment, the same region that Mel was just talking to you about. And we conducted 40 semi-structured interviews, and we tried to find people who could talk to different interests in the region. So like irrigators, recreationalists, people involved in land care, to name a few. We tried to find 2 to 3 people who could talk to each of these interests. We did talk to some people who could speak to Indigenous interests, but this talk isn't really going to be reflective of the positions of Indigenous groups, because we didn't have the time to really develop this as a co-design. And a lot of the things that I'm talking to you about are going to reflect value systems that don't necessarily match up with what we were getting out of our interviews with the Indigenous folks in the region. And so there was a bit of a mismatch, which in itself is quite interesting, but that is worth a different study. So we were interested in these two concepts broadly, values and priorities, how they relate to each other. And we led participants through a series of exercises that centered around the values that we found in policy documents. So that first study that Mel presented, we were able to get a list of all of the ways that all the local policy documents in the region talked about values. And we then refined that list to make it comprehensive and non-overlapping. We ended up with 26 values that we wrote on little cards, and we got participants to interact with. But before we even did that, we asked people open-ended questions about values. We just said, why does this river and the catchment matter to you? Why does it matter to others in your region? What's the meaning why you value it? So not just to give us a list, but to also give us the reason why that was important to them. And then for priorities, we had that list of values on little cards, and we asked people to do a sorting exercise where we asked them to arrange those cards from more important to less important on a table like the one I'm showing you here. So we also asked them other questions as part of this interview, but I only have enough time to present on a certain amount of things. So here's what we found, starting with values. The x-axis has the policy document values that we had pulled out, so things like recreation, connection to nature, connection to community, and I've ordered them based on themes. So we tried to find things that would talk to themes of social values, economic, environmental, Indigenous values, although I will say a lot of our participants did not necessarily interpret all of the Indigenous values as Indigenous values. So things like custodianship, stewardship, caring for country would often be interpreted as I think stewardship is very important to everyone, which is fair. The y-axis is how often people mentioned each of these values without our prompting. So an important thing to note is that when we were coding their dialogue, we pulled out every time they mentioned a value that corresponded to the policy document values. But 1/3 of what people talked about didn't match those policy document values at all. So one of the things that Mel had mentioned in her presentation that's useful to think about is whether or not what people value and say they value is reflected in this policy that we have written. And so what we're finding is some of it is, but some of it isn't. And a lot of the things that people talked about that didn't relate to policy document values were more abstract concepts, like connection to family or memory or generational identity in the catchment. So of the values that people did talk about that I'm showing you here, though, the big take home is that social values came out on top. I think nearly 75% of our participants talked about recreation, and then connection to nature was the next most important thing that they spoke about the most. So that's something that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. Priorities were a little bit more complicated, but before I get into that analysis, it's important to note that almost 3/4 of the people that we spoke about talked about being confused by the exercise. And this isn't that surprising. The sorting exercise that we got them to do, which if any of you guys are social scientists is called the Q method, it's notoriously frustrating asking people to sort things into more important and less important when they might want everything to be important. That's a frustrating experience to have. But a lot of our participants, their frustration came from saying that the words on the cards didn't match how they viewed the system. So it's important to note that consistent tension between not feeling represented by the language that policy documents use to describe values. So we wanted to see if there were patterns in how people prioritize the policy values in the table, and we used a factor analysis to interpret it and ended up with 4 factors associated with different sets of priorities. We can understand these factors both by where group members placed their cards on the table and also what they said while they were making decisions. So I'm going to show you a heat map that will show the average score that people in each factor gave to each policy value. So right now I'm just starting with factor 1. And for example, biodiversity, which I've circled here, is colored dark blue, which means that for the people in factor 1, they tended to rank biodiversity at that highest position in their Q sort. And so you can generally interpret this table by anything in blue is higher in value, it's a higher priority, and anything in red has been deprioritized. So people in this first factor are what we ended up calling our environmentalists, because if you look at the environmental values, I once again chunked the values for you in terms of environmental, indigenous, social, economic, and mixed themes. Oh, and mixed just means it's any value that participants said seem to talk about as ascribing to more than one value theme. So something like water storage, people spoke about as being related to both environmental and economic themes. So this factor 1 is, again, our environmentalists, and they would say things to reflect their decisions of placing the environment above other things. So they would say, up on top is the natural systems, the one I placed on the bottom are the human-centric types, and if humans weren't here, hopefully the river still would be. Or they'd say that they're struggling with agriculture because they think it's important, but that environmental values are more important. Factor 2 is characterized by trying to balance that social and ecological system. So they have more of an even keel between spreading out their high priorities between all of the categories, particularly social and environmental. And they say things like, we couldn't think of the whole ecological side of things without including humans. Factor 3, we called our sustainability-focused factor, and they tended to balance environment with economics, although they also tended to be the people who would push to the wayside anything that they didn't think was sustainable. So this included livestock as an industry, It also included certain types of agricultural practices, but it also included things like rare and threatened species. They'd say, we always say, oh, that one-footed llama with a curly ear, we have to maintain that species. But if climate change is coming, there's no way that they're going to be able to live in this new environment. What expenses are going to go to maintain them? And this is the group of people that tended to think that it wasn't quite worth it. And lastly, we have our people who focused on traditional economic values. So their main priorities were up in the industry and agriculture and everything economic, although they did have a high priority for anything natural system that supported that economic output. And they tended to say things that reflected that they weren't deprioritizing something necessarily because they didn't think it was important. They just thought it might come out of agriculture. So they'd say that their irrigation creates the habitat and landscape. So they think landscape connectivity is something that irrigation adds. So you don't have to prioritize landscape connectivity if irrigation already provides that. So now I want to look at the things that people prioritized and the things that people valued. And this is just a really simple chart of that. I'm bringing back that chart of the top priorities. And the gray arrows that I added, the chart of the top values. And the gray arrows that I added are the top priorities, the things that for each of those 4 factors ended up in their more important box that I've circled there in red. And if you look at all these values, you'll notice that social values really fell off the map. And so while people might talk about it, and if you ask people why the river matters to them, why the water and the catchment matters to them, the first thing that they'll mention, and mention most consistently, will be those social values, but that's not necessarily what they want to see prioritized and what's the most important. So in this way, our big take home is that values and priorities are similar, but they're not the same. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it quite briefly, is we also looked at what happens if you contextualize priorities with water scarcity. So the top of this table has the first 2 questions that I'd just described to you in detail. What do you care about, which relates to values, and what's most important, which relates to priorities. But really, it relates to an unconstrained priority. It's still different from saying, okay, well, if I gave you limited resources, now what would you prioritize? And further, what would you prioritize if I further reduced those resources? And that's sort of trying to get at, do priorities change when you contextualize it in terms of water scarcity and climate change? And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of everything that we found out from this exercise. We used evaluation exercise to try and interpret this, and that's what I'm showing on with the image on the right-hand side, where we'd have all of those cards that we used for the sorting exercise. We put them to the side, and we had people put tokens on them based on where they, if the tokens represented all the water in the catchment, based on where they wanted that water to go. But the main thing that I wanted to say is that people once again made different decisions it wasn't a one-to-one with the sorting exercise in terms of what people allocated the most water to, because now people weren't just thinking about what's most important, they're thinking what's most important and also what needs the most water. So people's priorities vary when you add constraints. But an interesting finding is that what people spoke about, how they justified their decisions, those quotes stayed pretty consistent. So people are talking about the same core values, which, if I refer back to Mel's presentation, is that broader, abstract, broad value sort of wider theme. But those core values, those broad values, aren't what's in the policy document. What's in the policy documents are these specific values that people tend to change more. So what does this all mean? We know that what people care about influences where and how water is used. And what I've shown you today demonstrates that values and priorities are different, and that people don't feel completely represented by the specific values that are in policy. But instead, they maintain these core values, these main justifications, when they're making decisions as they shift their specific priorities. So reflecting a little bit back to what Mel said, it's important to be intentional and transparent about what information you want to gain to make decisions. Because these community members, it's not that they're not being consulted, but somehow the information that they're giving isn't necessarily linking to what's then being put in the documents. And an important thing to think about is not just what information do you need, but are the methods that you're using to collect and elicit that information, is it actually giving you what you expect to see? Because we got deeper understandings of people's values by using these multiple and mixed methods. And understanding those core value systems might provide more meaningful and lasting information on community preferences than specific values could. All right.
Thanks, Maddie. I'm gonna bring back in the whole panel for some questions, and I'm gonna start off the questions with one for Simon at the CMA. You're about to embark at the CMAs across Victoria on a regional waterway planning process. Just wondering if you could talk to how you think the findings from this study on values will be relevant to that process and implementing a policy process in practice.
Yeah, I think, Errol, it's probably important, well, it's clearly important to understand people's values and what they are and how they influence priorities, picking up on the findings from Maddie's work. So, we're obviously in the process of getting underway with our waterway strategy at the moment. And, obviously being purposeful, intentional, transparent, all the things that Maddie was talking about with community engagement and build this into the engagement design up front. Knowing what people value and prioritise and understanding where and how those things sort of differ and being conscious of what approaches we might employ, I suppose, to elicit information helps us, or hopefully helps us, target and hone the way our strategy is developed and informs the decisions we might make on the community's behalf, in a sense, and hopefully the directions that are set by the strategy. And I suppose the findings should ideally sort of shape our approach to help us to be more conscious that the information we get, if you like, depends on the questions we ask and the frameworks we use too. So capturing those values early, devising or employing a framework, and thinking about some different approaches to ask about values and priorities would hopefully enrich the process, the strategy development process, and hopefully give us a better and deeper understanding of what's important to the community around water. And given limited resources, hopefully we don't misfire or are less likely to misfire or misdirect or kind of waste effort in what we're doing.
Thanks, Simon. Melissa, along with your role at Melbourne University, you're also the director of Tuddy Tuddy Cajun, and you've co-authored the Victorian Government policy on their commitment to water is life. Wondering if you can talk to some of the differences in the way that Indigenous communities think about values of water and how that's different to what's currently represented in our policy documents.
Yeah, thanks, Avril. And thanks, Maddie. I always love listening to your findings. Yeah, I agree with the differences that we're seeing between Indigenous values and ways of thinking about water versus how current policy frameworks and strategies are playing out, is that it's that lack of relationality. And so what Water is Life gave us the opportunity to do is put into a Victorian government policy document how traditional owners felt about waterways. And the things that came out most frequently in that is relationships to place. The connection between well-being of people and the well-being of the rivers. So, when environmental health is really poor, or when we see some, poor water quality, for example, there is a direct causation or a relationship with how people's well-being is reflected, or the changes in that. And I don't think that is a concept that is specific to First Nations peoples. We know that our basin communities struggle when our rivers struggle. We know the mental health impacts that our farmers are facing during drought or during, low flow times. So I think by being able to embed these Indigenous concepts that are probably a bit more well-rounded and more holistic and can be well articulated from an Indigenous perspective, if we can embed those into the ways that we're thinking about water sustainability and the Murray-Darling Basin, these are things that the wider community and farmers and towns and everything, people can actually connect to those sorts of concepts, and it's not just specific to our Indigenous communities. You're on mute still, Avril.
Haven't learned how to unmute yet. So there was a question that was sent through before the webinar asking about how irrigators were engaged with this project. And Melissa's just sort of said that some of these ideas about how important waterways are to communities is broader for all of the communities in the Murray-Darling Basin. Just wondering, Maddie, if you can elaborate on how stakeholders were engaged in your research, and also the sorts of comments they made on how I know you asked a question that you haven't presented today on how they see themselves represented in decision making and management.
So let me check if I'm interpreting this right. Whether or not they feel represented by policy itself. Almost everyone who I spoke to would have answered that question, which we did ask explicitly, with a, well, not completely sort of response. And that tended to vary on a spectrum of, I feel consulted but not heard, which is usually what a lot of people tended to reflect on. They would say, I've actually done a lot of these sorts of interviews with researchers or with managers, but I don't feel like my viewpoints are actually heard in the decisions that I'm receiving. To, I feel consulted, and I feel like the people who are making policy decisions are trying. To, oh yeah, it's okay, which is broadly people who feel like it's just an overwhelming job to be able to get everyone's opinions in, and they feel like things are fine. But the community members who I spoke to have a sense that there's a distinction between their local managers and the people who actually write policy, particularly politicians at a broad scale. And they have the sense that their local managers might be might have their backs, but not have a lot of the power to do things that they wanted to see done. But that the politicians have the power, but not necessarily the will towards it. So there's this really interesting dichotomy where they don't necessarily feel represented by the policy, but they do feel represented by some individuals who are their local managers.
I think that ties in nicely to another question that came through before the webinar, asking what the panel's views are on ensuring that regional values and aspirations are incorporated into the basin plan review process. And there was another question that came through, I guess, on matters of scale and how you think about the different scales of management and representing values at different scales. So just wondering if anyone on the panel wants to have a go at that small question.
If I could talk quickly on scale, I think the Raymond framework is a good one to have a look at if you're interested in scale, because what that does is it gives an overview of how you can have these broad values or world views articulated that can probably be scaled up or can be at, across a basin scale. And then as you get sort of into those specific values and values indicators, that has the potential to be more place-based and more appropriate depending on what region you're in, what conditions you're facing, what river systems, because we know the vast difference of landscapes across the basin that we see. So I think looking at something like the Raymond values typology is a really cool way of thinking about scale and how values can change depending on place, but in a way that is still able to be put into environmental strategies.
Thanks, Melissa. Simon or Maddie, did you want to add anything?
honestly think that Mel said everything that I would potentially want to add.
I'm conscious that we're almost up against time, so I'm just going to ask one final question, which is really around how the findings of this study are relevant to other regions, or can be rolled out to other places. So particularly the governance structures are slightly different in other states. And obviously the findings specifically to values in this project are about Northern Victoria. How do you think the findings from this study are relevant to or can be implied elsewhere?
I can start on that, and then Mel, you can add if you want. But I think that if I look at the findings at its most broad, there's just this question of an assumption of, is the information that you're looking for that you think would help best make decisions, particularly decisions in future as well as decisions in present, is that what you're actually collecting from community? Is that what you're actually talking about using shared language with management? Is the framework that you're using for understanding the system that you're writing policy for, is that shared amongst the people who are actually doing that work? And so creating this initial step of being critical of the information that you need to make decisions, and then figuring out the best methods that you could use to get that information. I think that's pretty relevant to anywhere that you're doing decision making or making policy. There's just a question of, is that level of disconnect the same, and that'll vary place to place.
We're right up against 2 o'clock, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming along. I'm just going to hand over to, I think, Avril to talk through some of the future opportunities.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Avril and Simon and Madeline and Melissa for presenting your findings here. It was great. And to the Australian Water School and Renee and Joel, who always help us through our technical difficulties as they come. So we really appreciate all the work you put in. Thanks, everybody, for attending. A recording link will be emailed to you, as well as uploaded to the Australian Water School website and YouTube channel. You will receive a certificate of attendance in the next 2 business days. And if you don't mind, please completing a short 1-minute survey that'll pop up at the conclusion. That would be great. And we do these webinars first Wednesday of every month. So please stay tuned to the Australian Water School's upcoming webinars, and we look forward to seeing you at future One Basin ones. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.